Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and with their environment. This lesson provides an introduction to ecology and some important definitions, and here are the objectives. Let's start by considering a squirrel that's feeding on an acorn. It's doing that to get energy from the acorn and also to get molecules from it with which to build its own body. And those got into the acorn when the oak performed photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process that takes in carbon dioxide and light and uses them to build carbon compounds that store energy for the plant and for anything that eats the plant. Now, if the squirrel became a meal for a fox or for a hawk, then the energy in those molecules would then be passed along to the fox or the hawk. And when one of these dies, their bodies might be broken down by things like earthworms or fungi or bacteria. Now, this line here from the acorn to the squirrel to a fox, for example, that's a food chain that shows feeding relationships. But when we start combining these, we get a food web, which is a interconnected set of food chains. So that's a food web. And energy is flowing through this food chain. It started off incorporated into the plant by the process of photosynthesis and then passed along to each thing that fed on the plant and then fed on that. And there's a continuous flow of energy into these food chains and into this food web by photosynthesis here using light energy at the start. That's where ultimately all the energy comes from. And then ultimately all the energy is used by these organisms to move, etc., and lost to the environment as heat. In contrast, nutrients aren't lost, but nutrients cycle through the food chains and food web. The molecules that are in the food that's being consumed don't disappear here, but they get recycled. So when bacteria or fungus breaks down one of these animals after they die, the molecules that made up their bodies are now in the soil and available for plants to incorporate them once again. Now let's introduce some terminology. The trophic level refers to the feeding level of an organism in a food chain or food web. And the oak or the plant is called the primary producer. Producers are organisms that capture energy, for example, through photosynthesis and use it to make carbon compounds. And then those carbon compounds and the energy stored in them can get passed on to the next feeding level, the next trophic level. And that next trophic level in our example here was the squirrel, which is a consumer. A consumer gets its food and energy by eating other organisms, and the first one in the chain would be called the primary consumer. In contrast, the hawk is eating the squirrel, which was the primary consumer, so we call it a secondary consumer. Again, it's getting its energy and its molecules by eating something else. That makes it a consumer. And although we didn't have them in our example, if there was something that ate the hawk and then something that ate that, then we could have tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers as well. We can also talk about the mode of nutrition, how an organism gets its energy and organic molecules. And so plants, like the oak in our example, are autotrophs. Troph, again, referring to feeding, and auto for self, so they're self-feeding. Autotrophs, like plants, don't get their energy and their organic or their carbon-containing molecules from eating anything else. They make them themselves, as we saw in this example through photosynthesis, using inorganic carbon in carbon dioxide and the light in light energy. So autotrophs make their own organic food molecules. In contrast, both the squirrel and the hawk are heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are organisms that get their organic food molecules, and therefore also their energy, from eating other organisms. And so you can see that the consumers are ultimately dependent on the producers, or alternatively the heterotrophs are ultimately dependent on the autotrophs. In our example above, it's the oak that's first capturing energy in the form of light and then making that available to all the other organisms in the food web. There are also two other kinds of heterotrophs that are in the food web above. There are detritivores and saprotrophs. Detritivores are exemplified above by the earthworm. So an earthworm is a detritivore, and the fungus above is a saprotroph. Both of these are heterotrophs. They get their organic food molecules from other organisms. But they're doing different things than the consumers in the food web. The consumers are eating live or recently dead organisms, whereas these detritivores and saprotrophs are both decomposers. They're breaking down already dead material. The earthworm is doing it by taking in food into its body and then digesting it or breaking it down. So detritivores have internal digestion. Again, they break down food inside of their bodies. In contrast, saprotrophs break down food outside of their bodies and then absorb the nutrients. So fungi can secrete enzymes into the environment around them, break down, digest their food outside of their bodies, and then take in the already broken down nutrients. So saprotrophs have external digestion. That's the key difference between these two different kinds of decomposers. Detritivores have internal digestion, while saprotrophs have external digestion. Let's look at some more definitions that we need for learning about ecology. A species is a group of individual organisms that can actually or potentially interbreed in nature, meaning have offspring. And when they do that, they produce viable, fertile offspring. So viable means that the offspring survive, and fertile means that the offspring themselves can have offspring. Now, defining a species is actually a very tricky prospect, and this is only one definition. It's often known as the biological species concept. That's the name of this definition. There are other ways you could define a species or a type of organism, for example, by how they appear, and that's often done as well. You can imagine that this has some real advantages over just trying to classify organisms by what they look like, because different types or different species of organisms can look similar. But this definition also has some problems. For example, how do you use a definition based on interbreeding when you're talking about organisms that only reproduce asexually? How do you use it when you're talking about extinct organisms that you really can't tell if they could interbreed with other organisms or not? So defining a species or imposing this kind of human-created idea onto the natural world gets very tricky, but this is an often used definition. Something particularly nice about this definition of a species is that it works well with our understanding of genetics, because a group of organisms that can only interbreed with each other and not with any other organisms are only going to be swapping alleles amongst themselves through breeding and not with anybody else. And so they form a closed gene pool. And so that's really nice when you want to think about organisms genetically. If we go up one level, a population means all the individuals from one species living together in a particular place and time. So eastern gray squirrels are a species, but a particular group of eastern gray squirrels living in a particular park, that's a population. Going up another level, a community comprises all of the populations of different species living in a particular space. So if we stay with that park and now we consider any other animals and plants living in that park with the squirrels, that's a community. And going up another level, the ecosystem is the community of organisms plus all of the abiotic factors with which they interact. Now, abiotic means non-living. So this includes things like sunlight, water, wind, temperature, the weather, climate, rocks, etc. So going from species up to population, up to community, up to ecosystem. So that's a look at food chains and food webs and some of the important terms that we need to know as we start to study ecology.